July 1944. Hill 192, just east of Saint-Lô, in the Bocage country of Normandy. A German paratrooper of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, holding that hill, has already seen a great deal of war. He fought at Cassino. He fought in Russia. He knows what artillery sounds like, what it does to a body, what the rules of it are supposed to be. And in July of 1944, on this specific hill, those rules stopped working in a way his training gave him no category for. The American official record of the campaign contains a detail that reads, on first encounter, like a transcription error. The 2nd Infantry Division, one American division, fired as many as 20 time-on-target missions in a single night against Hill 192. Not 20 shells, not 20 barrages. 20 separate, precisely synchronized concentrations, each involving multiple artillery battalions firing simultaneously so every round landed in the same instant, at positions where, by German accounts, no soldier was actually standing. Hedgerows already cleared the previous night, roads nobody was walking, ground that had already been shelled once and would be shelled again regardless. The artillery commander of the neighboring 29th Infantry Division, Brigadier General William Sands, recorded in his division's own history that on a single day in mid-July, his guns fired 459 missions and expended more than 13,000 rounds in 24 hours. One hill, one day, 13,000 shells. When American photo reconnaissance flew over Hill 192 afterward, the ground had absorbed so many craters that one officer, quoted in the division's official account, described it from the air as resembling a moth-eaten blanket. To a German artillery officer trained on Truppenführung, the Wehrmacht's foundational field manual, this was not war conducted competently. It looked like a violation of the entire professional discipline artillery was supposed to represent. Every German shell was pre-plotted, calculated, rationed, accounted for. Every round had a specific destination, and every act of firing was treated as a transaction with a cost that had to be justified. Watching American guns burn through ammunition at bushes, at empty mud, at nothing anyone could identify as a target, German commanders across the line reached the only conclusion their doctrine equipped them to reach. The Americans were incompetent, wasteful, firing blind. Soldiers who had never been properly taught to count their shells. They were wrong, not about the volume, which was real, but about what the volume was actually for. The Americans had not stopped hitting their targets. They had stopped aiming in the conventional sense entirely, and understanding why requires going back to a specific economic constraint that shaped every decision the German army ever made about a cannon, and that in 1944 the American army had simply removed from its own calculations. The distinction sounds, at first hearing, almost too simple to explain the largest artillery expenditure of the entire war. But it is worth taking seriously precisely because German officers who lived through it, some of them among the most professionally capable commanders the Wehrmacht produced, spent the rest of their careers, in several documented cases the rest of their lives, trying to articulate what had actually happened to them on hills like this one, and largely failed to find the language for it inside their own training. For any German artillery officer who served from 1941 onward, one number lived permanently in the back of his mind: 50. That was, by late 1941, roughly how many rounds a heavy German artillery piece on the Eastern Front could expect to have on hand for sustained combat. If Soviet infantry came forward in successive waves, 50 rounds meant a battery had minutes of real fighting before its guns went silent and its crew held nothing more useful than machined steel. By 1944, the figure had not meaningfully improved, and in several documented sectors had actually worsened, as Allied strategic bombing increasingly disrupted the specific rail and manufacturing chains that kept German ammunition production running at all. Scarcity was not an occasional problem for German artillery. It was the organizing fact around which the entire arm's doctrine, training, and logistics were built. A German gun crew never had enough shells. A German battery never had enough guns. A German regiment never had enough horses to move the guns it did possess. And that last detail carries more weight than it initially suggests. In 1944, the majority of German artillery in Normandy was still horse-drawn. Not in 1918. In 1944, the same nation that had developed the V-2 rocket, the first operational jet fighter, and the first true assault rifle, was hauling its field guns with roughly the horsepower Napoleon had used to move his own cannon toward Moscow. This was not, it is worth noting, a failure of German engineering ambition. German industry had designed perfectly capable mechanized artillery prime movers on paper. What it lacked was the steel allocation, the fuel supply, and the manufacturing capacity to actually build and fuel them at the scale the front required, once the same industrial base was simultaneously trying to sustain tank production, aircraft production, and submarine construction under increasingly disrupted wartime conditions. Horses, unlike a half-track prime mover, required no petroleum at all and could, in a pinch, forge locally. A specific practical advantage that made them, however anachronistic, the rational choice for an economy that could no longer guarantee fuel deliveries to every unit that theoretically needed them. General Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army against British and Canadian forces in Normandy, left a specific written account of what his own artillery park actually looked like at one of the most consequential moments of the entire war. Guns captured from France in 1940, guns captured from Czechoslovakia in 1939, guns captured from the Soviets on the Eastern Front, several pieces dating to manufacture during the First World War itself, matching the correct ammunition to each distinct gun type, maintaining separate firing tables for each. Keeping a coherent supply chain running behind such a patchwork inventory was, in Eberbach's own description, a logistical nightmare, a phrase military historians have used to describe the situation ever since, because no more precise term captures it. A single German artillery regiment, by this point in the war, might field 5 or 6 functionally distinct gun types simultaneously, each requiring its own ammunition specification, its own maintenance parts, its own trained crew familiar with its specific quirks. A logistical burden American artillery units, standardized almost entirely around a small handful of common calibers, simply never had to carry. German doctrine, correspondingly, was not written by officers who believed in abundance. It was written by officers who treated every individual shell as though it might be the last one available, and Truppenführung codified that belief explicitly. Artillery was to be employed with maximum economy, every shot serving a specific, prioritized purpose. Counter-battery fire first, to silence enemy guns, then fire on targets threatening friendly infantry directly, then, only afterward, harassment of enemy command and rear areas. A methodical, ranked system engineered specifically to ensure that scarce ammunition was never spent on anything but the highest value target available at that moment. The manual's authors, writing in the early 1930s under a military establishment still constrained by the Treaty of Versailles' limits on German rearmament, had genuinely good reason to build their entire artillery doctrine around economy rather than volume. Germany's actual production capacity at the time the doctrine was drafted gave planners no realistic alternative. What made the doctrine specifically costly by 1944 was not that it had been poorly conceived for the conditions it was designed under, but that German industrial capacity never expanded fast enough or far enough to outgrow the scarcity assumptions built into it a decade earlier. While American doctrine, drafted later and against an entirely different production trajectory, had been free to build itself around an assumption of surplus from the outset. This doctrine produced genuine technical excellence within its own terms. German artillery, when it did fire, fired with remarkable precision. Pre-plotted survey positions, careful mathematical bracketing, a trained crew capable of placing its first ranging rounds inside a 50-meter circle at 10 kilometers range. American intelligence officers who captured German firing tables during the war studied them with real professional respect. The accuracy was not in question. What that accuracy had been traded for was speed and flexibility. The German system's dependence on pre-surveyed positions meant that any genuinely new target, one appearing suddenly on an axis the survey team had not previously plotted, required 10 to 15 minutes of careful calculation before effective fire could begin. 10 minutes is an eternity in a fluid battle. It is frequently the entire difference between catching an advancing column in the open and watching it vanish into the nearest tree line before the first shell lands. German batteries, the American official histories note with what one American historian described as monotonous regularity, were also specifically reluctant to engage in artillery duels, not from any lack of courage, but from simple arithmetic. A battery that spent its limited ammunition trading fire with an opposing battery would have nothing left when the actual infantry assault arrived. Better, by this logic, to go silent, conserve, and wait for the moment every remaining shell genuinely had to count. This produced, across the German officer corps by 1944, a single deeply internalized professional discipline. Waste nothing. Aim everything. Justify every round fired to a superior who would eventually ask for the justification. A German major captured after the Battle of the Bulge asked in interrogation to characterize American artillery from the receiving end, returned repeatedly to one specific observation. The Americans fired without targets. To him, this was not evidence of strength. It was evidence that American commanders did not understand their own profession, a judgment his interrogators recorded without apparent correction, suggesting the American officers present found the observation more revealing of the prisoners' assumptions than of anything American gunners had actually done wrong. The U.S. Army's doctrinal term for what Hill 192's German defenders were actually experiencing is harassing and interdiction fire, H&I fire, 3 words most civilians have never encountered, describing precisely what a German commander would call inexplicable waste, and what an American fire direction officer, working from a published tactical manual with its own line item in the theater ammunition budget, would call a deliberate and carefully justified method. The underlying premise is simple enough that only a genuinely industrial nation could afford to believe in it without qualification. You do not need to kill the enemy with every round fired. You need to break him. Select a road junction, 12 kilometers behind the German front line, with no forward observer watching it directly. You cannot see who uses it, but any competent staff officer can reasonably assume the Germans move supplies through it after dark. Rations, ammunition, replacement troops, fuel. Drop a single shell on that junction at 02:23 hours with no specific target. Another at 03:07. Another at 04:18. Another at 05:12. Not a barrage, not a coordinated concentration, simply one round at irregular intervals across the night. What happens to the German supply column scheduled to use that junction that night has nothing to do with whether any individual shell actually lands on a truck. The column either does not move at all, or moves and loses a vehicle and stops, or diverts onto a longer route that costs twice the travel time, or the exhausted driver, kept awake because a second junction on his route received the identical treatment, falls asleep at the wheel. Or the ration cart never reaches the forward battalion at all, and by the following afternoon there are men in foxholes who have gone 2 days without food, shaking from cold and hunger rather than from wounds. None of those specific German soldiers has been struck by a single American shell. Every one of them has been degraded by American artillery just as thoroughly as if the round had landed in his own position. American planning staffs treated the irregular timing itself as the load-bearing element of the entire tactic, rather than an incidental detail. A predictable pattern, the same junction shelled at the same hour every night, would have let German logistics officers simply schedule around it, moving supplies in the specific windows the pattern left open. American fire direction centers deliberately varied both the interval and the target selection from night to night, drawing in part on randomized timing tables specifically designed to deny German planners any exploitable regularity. A German supply officer attempting to map the pattern across several nights would find no pattern to map, which meant every single night carried the same uncertain risk, regardless of how carefully he studied the preceding week's shelling. American doctrinal writing called this a force multiplier, plain military language for a genuinely counterintuitive proposition. You do not have to hit anyone in order to win. This is precisely what German defenders across from Hill 192 were watching, without the doctrinal vocabulary to name it. American guns were not firing at targets in the German sense of the word. They were firing at a German soldier's sleep, his stomach, his nerves, his confidence that the war still operated according to rules his training had prepared him to read, and the Wehrmacht had no meaningful countermeasure available, because it could not have executed the identical tactic even had its officers wanted to. It did not have the shells. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent more sustained time embedded with American infantry than any journalist of the war, filed a dispatch in 1943 that captures, with characteristic understatement, the exact moment American soldiers themselves began to grasp what their own artillery arm had become. American officers, Pyle wrote, told him plainly that they had more guns available than they knew what to do with, that an entire sector's worth of artillery could be centered onto a single point on command, and that veteran German prisoners had specifically told their interrogators they had never previously encountered anything comparable. More guns than we know what to do with in the middle of the war is not the language of an army rationing its ammunition. It is the specific worldview of a nation whose factories were producing 155mm shells at a rate exceeding 567,000 rounds per month. At Hill 192, the 2nd Infantry Division's 20 nightly time-on-target missions were not incidental excess. They were doctrine, and the doctrine's underlying instruction was straightforward. Never let German infantry rest. Never let them resupply without cost. Never let them forget for more than a few consecutive minutes that they remain under fire. The Army's own encyclopedic definition of harassing fire states its intended effect with unusual bluntness. It denies sleep, denies resupply, and over sufficient time induces what the doctrine itself terms a dissociative reaction produced by cumulative exhaustion and fear. The Germans on Hill 192 were not being shelled because American observers had confirmed they were present in a given position. They were being shelled because they might be present, and because a soldier who cannot sleep, cannot safely resupply, and cannot trust his own foxhole as genuine cover is functioning, for practical combat purposes, at a fraction of his actual capacity, regardless of whether a single shell ever reaches him directly. The specific institutional confidence required to sustain this doctrine for months at a time deserves separate mention, because it was not simply a matter of raw ammunition supply. American fire direction centers had to trust, at every level of the chain, that expending thousands of rounds nightly against unconfirmed targets would not eventually produce a supply shortage at the exact moment a genuine crisis required maximum available firepower. That trust rested entirely on the specific reliability of the production and transport chain behind it, a chain that had, by 1944, demonstrated often enough that it simply did not run dry, that battery commanders could plan missions against empty hilltops without a second thought about whether the ammunition would still be there next week. On August 25, 1944, a logistics system began operating on the roads of western France with no meaningful historical precedent. Officially designated the Red Ball Express, it comprised nearly 6,000 trucks, predominantly the 2.5-ton GMC cargo vehicles universally known as the Deuce and a Half, running continuously day and night along a dedicated route from Cherbourg toward the advancing front, with civilian traffic explicitly banned from its roads. At peak throughput, the system moved roughly 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Across its full 83 days of operation, it delivered more than 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts to 28 advancing American divisions. A single 155mm shell weighs 95 pounds. A meaningful fraction of that daily tonnage was artillery ammunition specifically. Roughly 3/4 of the Express's drivers were black soldiers, serving in an army that for most of its institutional history had refused to place black troops in combat roles at all, men categorized by the same institution as unfit for the front line, who became, in this specific role, one of the single most consequential reasons the front line could continue fighting at the pace it did. The physical demands placed on these drivers deserve specific mention, because the Express's throughput figures obscure the human cost of sustaining them. Drivers routinely operated on schedules exceeding 20 consecutive hours, navigating narrow French roads at night with blackout headlights, past the wreckage of vehicles that had gone off the road from exhaustion, delivering cargo to units that had no comparable understanding of what it had taken to get supplies to them on schedule. The system consumed vehicles nearly as fast as it consumed fuel, Maintenance crews working alongside the route kept trucks running well past the point civilian standards would have retired them, because a broken truck removed from the route represented tonnage that simply did not arrive that day, with no slack built into the schedule to absorb the loss. Set that logistics network against what German forces were actually working with. Eberbach's mixed artillery park has already established the equipment picture. The supply situation behind it was, if anything, worse. American intelligence assessments and post-war analysis both confirmed that the Wehrmacht in the West relied on horse-drawn transport for a substantial portion of its artillery ammunition delivery well into 1944. Several German infantry formations fighting in the Ardennes that December reportedly maintained more horses on strength than combat riflemen. A horse can move roughly a ton of cargo, requires feeding regardless of whether it is working, and moves at a walking pace under the best conditions. A perfectly serviceable transport animal, and a genuinely crippling liability once the opposing army has 6,000 trucks moving 12,500 tons a day along a dedicated highway. The American production figures underlying this system are, on their own, difficult to hold in perspective against any modern comparison. In May 1942 alone, American factories produced 567,000 rounds of 155mm artillery ammunition, a single month, a single caliber, close to 600,000 shells. For comparison, in 2023, with the entire modern American manufacturing base directed at the specific problem, the Pentagon's stated production target for 155mm shells ran to roughly 28,000 rounds per month. A single month of 1942-level American wartime production, in other words, exceeded roughly 2 full years of 2023-level American industrial output in that same specific artillery caliber. The comparison is not offered to flatter the past at the expense of the present. It reflects a specific, deliberate wartime mobilization of civilian manufacturing capacity. Automobile plants, appliance factories, entire industries converted wholesale to munitions production that no peacetime industrial base, then or now, sustains without the same total mobilization. This is precisely what German planners could not understand, and could not have understood regardless of how carefully they studied the evidence, because understanding it required accepting a premise Truppenführung had no conceptual room for, that war could be fought as a contest of throughput rather than a contest of precision. American doctrine, the harassing fire, the interdiction missions, the 20 nightly concentrations onto an empty Norman hilltop, rested entirely on treating ammunition as a continuously flowing river, rather than a finite, carefully husbanded reservoir. A river running from American factories, across Atlantic convoys, through Cherbourg's captured port facilities, along the Red Ball Express's dedicated highway, out to batteries positioned across Normandy, Belgium, and eventually German soil itself. Waste as a meaningful concept exists only within a reservoir economy. It has no real analytical purchase inside a river economy, because the river simply keeps flowing, regardless of how much any single battery expends on a given night. A photograph preserved in the National Archives, dated December 31, 1944, documents Battery C of the 28th Field Artillery Battalion, 8th Infantry Division. 3 American gunners stand beside a 155mm shell on which they have painted, in white lettering, a message. For Adolf. Unhappy New Year. They are visibly grinning, moments from firing that specific shell into Germany, and they have taken the time to write a joke on it first. That shell had consumed a machinist in Pennsylvania perhaps a few hours of labor. The 3 men beside it understood, correctly, that its replacement would arrive by truck well before their gun barrel had finished cooling. That specific casual confidence bears no resemblance to how a German gun crew on the Eastern Front in 1941 could conceivably have behaved. A crew counting down from 50 total rounds per gun does not paint jokes on the 49th. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had, by the summer of 1944, watched an army do nearly everything an army can do to an opponent across a genuinely distinguished career. The 1940 campaign against France, the construction and command of the Africa Corps, a reputation earned honestly enough that even his enemies used the nickname Desert Fox as sincere professional respect rather than mockery. His field reports from this period, first from Italy and then from Normandy, survive in language that, for an officer of Rommel's characteristic professional restraint, amounts to something close to alarm. From Italy, he wrote of the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and stated plainly that this specific superiority had broken open positions his own forces had considered secure. From Normandy, he wrote of Allied artillery's great superiority and, in a specific phrase historians have quoted for decades since, the outstandingly large supply of ammunition sustaining it. The German field marshal, in the midst of the single most consequential defensive campaign of his career, identifying the fundamental problem confronting him not as American tactics, courage, or generalship, but specifically as the American ammunition supply chain. Rommel's specific choice of language matters here because it reflects a professional soldier arriving, reluctantly and near the end of his own career, at a diagnosis his training had never prepared him to make. German officers were taught, from their earliest professional education, to assess an opposing force primarily through the lens of tactical skill, leadership quality, and equipment specification, the categories Truppenführung actually measured an enemy by. Rommel's field reports increasingly abandoned that framework in favor of a category German doctrine had never formally recognized as decisive in its own right: sheer sustained industrial output, measured not in individual weapons, but in tonnage delivered per day. He was not the only senior German officer to reach this conclusion independently. Fritz Bayerlein, who had served as Rommel's own chief of staff in North Africa before taking command of the Panzer Lehr Division, arguably the single most lavishly equipped armored formation the Wehrmacht ever fielded, experienced American artillery directly on July 25, 1944, during the opening of Operation Cobra, the American breakout attempt near Saint-Lô. American ground forces preceded their attack with what remains, by most technical assessments, the most concentrated combined aerial and artillery bombardment of the entire European war. Bayerlein's post-war account describes bombers arriving as though on a conveyor belt, laying carpets of explosive back and forth across his position, artillery emplacements destroyed outright, tanks overturned and buried under displaced earth, infantry positions flattened, every road and track in the sector rendered impassable. By midday, in his own description, the entire area resembled a moonscape, its bomb craters overlapping rim to rim, every signal line severed, effective command no longer possible in any meaningful sense. The psychological effect on his surviving troops, Bayerlein wrote, was indescribable. Several men, by his account, ran into the open in a state approaching madness, and were killed by shell fragments before anyone could recover them. Bayerlein estimated afterward that he had lost at least 70% of his division's effective strength to a combination of death, wounds, and what he specifically termed numbness, his own word for a psychological collapse that outright combat casualty figures alone could not fully capture. That is what sustained, deliberately excessive American artillery did to the professional judgment of a veteran soldier trained specifically to read and trust the conventional rules of combat. It did not simply kill him, it dismantled his working ability to identify when he was actually safe, a category of damage no German firing table had a line item for. While Rommel filed his reports and Bayerlein watched his division disintegrate, the American army had been developing and deliberately withholding a further technical advantage that would compound the entire equation once released. The variable time fuse, commonly called the VT fuse, was a miniature radio transmitter built into an artillery shell's nose, designed to detonate the round automatically at the mathematically optimal height above ground rather than on ground contact. A conventional contact fuse shell, striking soft earth, frequently buried itself partially before detonating, dissipating much of its lethal fragmentation upward and outward in a pattern a prone soldier had a genuine statistical chance of surviving. The VT fuse eliminated that survival margin by converting every round into a precisely timed airburst, showering fragmentation directly downward onto anyone below, regardless of posture. A foxhole no longer constituted meaningful cover. Lying flat no longer constituted meaningful cover. The only reliable protection was overhead shelter, which most field positions simply did not have. The engineering behind the fuse itself represented a genuinely difficult miniaturization problem for the period. Fitting a functioning radio transmitter, its power source, and its detonation circuitry, into a nose cone small enough to fit a standard artillery shell, while ensuring the entire assembly survived being fired from a cannon, an acceleration force exceeding several thousand times gravity, without the delicate electronics simply shattering on the way out of the barrel. American engineers at Section T of the Office of Scientific Research and Development solved this problem through a combination of vacuum tubes specifically hardened against the shock of firing and a novel power supply design. The resulting fuse remains, by most post-war technical assessments, one of the more sophisticated pieces of battlefield electronics fielded by any combatant in the entire war, developed under a secrecy classification comparable to the Manhattan Project itself. The Army Air Forces had specifically restricted V-T-fused shells to anti-aircraft use against German aircraft through most of 1944, out of a documented concern that a single unexploded example, recovered intact by German engineers, could be reverse-engineered into anti-aircraft ammunition capable of devastating Allied bomber formations at a scale the war effort could not absorb. On December 16, 1944, the opening day of the Battle of the Bulge, that restriction was lifted, and V-T-fused shells began flowing to American ground artillery batteries across the entire Western Front. General George Patton wrote to the War Department days afterward, in a letter that remains part of the documented historical record, describing a German battalion caught attempting to cross the Sauer River. Patton reported firing a full battalion concentration of V-T-fuse rounds directly into the crossing attempt and provided a specific casualty figure, recorded, in his own careful phrasing, by actual count, of 702 German dead from that single engagement. Patton added in the same letter that once every army possessed this specific shell, warfare itself would require entirely new tactical methods to survive it. Layer this onto everything already established. American forward observers flying unarmed Piper Cub L-4 Grasshopper aircraft at roughly 1,000 feet conducted an estimated 97% of all artillery adjustment missions in the European theater between D-Day and the German surrender. Any German soldier who spotted a grasshopper circling overhead understood, in the documented language of the Army's own liaison aviation history, that a lethal American concentration would likely fall within minutes. Daylight movement, in that same history-specific phrasing, had become problematic, a polite institutional euphemism for something closer to suicidal. Americans could observe essentially anything that moved in daylight. Americans could fire instantly at anything observed. Americans could additionally fire harassing missions at everything they could not directly observe at all. And beginning in December 1944, American shells detonated above a German position rather than inside the ground beneath it. For a German commander reading the situation from the receiving end, no coherent tactical response existed. Cover no longer functioned as cover. Daylight movement invited immediate artillery response. Night movement invited harassing fire calculated to catch exactly this kind of movement. Counter-battery fire was structurally impossible to execute in time, since by the moment a German crew completed its firing solution calculation, the American Fire Direction Center had typically already shifted to an entirely different target. German unit rotation schedules, designed around a standard number of days a formation could reasonably be expected to hold a static position before requiring relief, began breaking down specifically because commanders could no longer predict how quickly a given position would degrade a unit's fighting capacity. The old planning assumptions, built around casualties from direct fire and conventional bombardment, simply did not account for a defensive line that lost effectiveness from exhaustion and interrupted supply at a rate no previous German campaign had produced. March 23, 1945. The Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland, uncrossed by any hostile army in roughly a century and a half, not since Napoleon. German defensive planning had been built explicitly around the assumption that the river itself, regardless of Allied firepower elsewhere, would extract an unacceptable price for any attempted crossing. On the evening of March 23rd, the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson, coordinating with Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group, opened fire on German positions along the eastern bank. Published accounts of the operation describe roughly 270 American guns firing in the opening phase, joined by British and Canadian artillery to bring the combined total to approximately 4,000 pieces, muzzle flash visible by multiple contemporary accounts along the entire length of the flat western riverbank. The bombardment reportedly sustained a rate approaching 1,000 rounds per minute, with more than 65,000 total rounds expended before the first assault boat entered the water. The specific scale of this single preparatory bombardment is worth setting against everything established earlier in this account. The 2nd Infantry Division's 20 nightly time-on-target missions against Hill 192, extraordinary in July 1944, would by March 1945 have registered as a comparatively modest single night's effort against the combined weight brought to bear on the Rhine's eastern bank in a matter of hours. The doctrine had not changed in its underlying logic between Normandy and the Rhine. What had changed was the sheer volume of resources the American and Allied logistics chain could now bring to a single point simultaneously, 9 months into a supply system that had spent that entire period refining exactly how fast shells could move from an American factory floor to a European riverbank. The assault battalions of the 30th Infantry Division crossed expecting the costliest river assault of the entire war. They encountered, by most accounts, remarkably little organized resistance. German offenders on the eastern bank had been suppressed so comprehensively by the preceding bombardment that the first American waves landed against what amounted to a broken defensive line rather than a coherent one. Within 4 days, 9th Army had established a bridgehead 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. The Rhine, treated for a century and a half as the definitive limit of what an opposing army could achieve against German territory, had ceased to function as a meaningful obstacle. Not because American infantry outfought German infantry in the conventional sense, and not because American armor technically outperformed German armor, but because American artillery had already placed 65,000 rounds onto the eastern bank before the first man stepped into a boat. The German army that surrendered in May 1945 did not surrender purely because it had exhausted its manpower. It surrendered, unit by unit, having worked out over the preceding 18 months of continuous contact that the specific arithmetic of this particular war was one Germany's industrial base could not compete inside. You cannot sustain effective resistance when every plausible road junction receives an unpredictable shell at 02:23 hours, when a single hilltop absorbs 20 separate synchronized concentrations in one night, when the opposing force maintains continuous aerial observation at 1,000 feet across the entire front, when incoming shells detonate above a foxhole rather than inside the ground beneath it, and when the opposing logistics system is, in practical terms, a continuously moving river of trucks that simply does not stop. American official histories record, with the same monotonous regularity noted earlier, that captured German prisoners consistently remarked on the volume of American fire, its accuracy, its speed, its capacity to arrive without warning, and, in a specific recurring phrase across dozens of separate interrogations, on what those prisoners perceived as American commanders' apparent indifference to the ammunition being expended. Here is the complete forensic accounting. German officers were not incorrect in their raw observation. American artillery genuinely did fire thousands of rounds at positions where, in the narrow sense a German officer understood the term, no confirmed target actually existed. No German field manual would have authorized this expenditure. It violated essentially every principle of ammunition discipline German artillery training had instilled across a professional career. Judged by the specific metric German doctrine actually used, shells expended per confirmed enemy casualty, American artillery performance would have registered, by any conventional German assessment, as a genuine professional catastrophe. 10 shells per German casualty in a good outcome, frequently 100, occasionally 1,000 rounds directed at a hilltop where nobody was actually present that night. The metric itself was the error, not the American performance measured against it. The relevant American calculation was never shells expended per casualty inflicted. It was what a given volume of fire denied the German army's capacity to function: daylight movement, uninterrupted sleep, timely resupply, the ability to mass an organized counterattack in an assembly area that had already absorbed a division's worth of artillery before the attacking force finished forming up. There were, in the end, no genuinely equal terms available in this specific contest, because one side's shells moved like continuously flowing water, and the other side's were rationed in allotments of 50 per gun. The specific conceptual leap Truppenführung had no room for, in the same sense already established, was that the American system was never organized around the individual shell at all. It was organized around the cumulative denial of enemy possibility, aggregated across thousands of rounds, hundreds of separate road junctions, and months of continuous pressure. American staff studies compiled after the war attempted to quantify this aggregate effect directly, estimating that harassing fire programs across the European theater accounted for a meaningfully larger share of German logistical delay than of German casualties outright, a finding that validated the doctrine's own stated premise, using exactly the kind of statistical rigor the doctrine itself had never needed to justify its use in the field. A German gun crew, however skilled, could not have executed this doctrine even with complete tactical understanding of how it worked, because it lacked every precondition the doctrine actually required: the shells, the trucks to move them, the domestic manufacturing base to replace them at the necessary rate, the Piper Cubs providing continuous aerial observation, the fire direction centers networked by radio across an entire theater, the proximity fuse converting every round into a guaranteed airburst. Lacking those preconditions, German doctrine had to be built around scarcity as its organizing premise, and German officers, reading American abundance through that same scarcity-trained lens, had no available category to place it in besides incompetence. Rommel and Bayerlein each worked this out from their own end of the collapse, in the terms already described above. The unnamed German major, interrogated after the bulge, correctly observed that American gunners were not aiming in any sense his training recognized. He simply lacked the framework to understand that American commanders had concluded, above the level of any individual battery, that aiming in the traditional sense was no longer the actual objective. The objective was denial, sustained continuously, across every hour a German soldier might otherwise have used to move, eat, sleep, or reorganize, each individual shell representing a measurable, specific cost against an American manufacturing base that had produced 567,000 rounds of a single artillery caliber in 1 month during the spring of 1942 alone. The post-war record contains one further detail worth closing on, because it illustrates how completely the two doctrines' underlying premises talked past each other even after the war had ended. German ordnance officers interviewed by Allied technical intelligence teams in 1945 and 1946 asked directly to assess American artillery doctrine now that the fighting had stopped and professional candor carried no operational risk, continued in several documented cases to describe the harassing fire concept as fundamentally unsound military practice. Sound in its observed results, several conceded, but built on a premise no responsible artillery officer should accept as a general principle, because an army that assumed unlimited ammunition would eventually, in some future conflict, be wrong about that assumption, and pay a catastrophic price for having built its entire doctrine around it. It was, in its way, the same scarcity-trained instinct still operating years after the specific war that had exposed its limits, evaluating an unfamiliar system by the only professional standard its own training had ever supplied. War, reduced to its essential economics, is ultimately a contest over what each side can afford to expend. German doctrine had been built by an institution that could afford precision and nothing beyond it. American doctrine had been built by an institution that had concluded, correctly and at scale, that the entire concept of wasted ammunition simply did not apply to a force whose industrial base treated shells as a continuously renewable resource, rather than a carefully rationed reserve.